Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1128 continues our adventure into this land of mystery, and in this video, I'll be going through all of my thoughts on these last two chapters. So if you're interested in a brief discussion on chapter 1127 as well, be sure to stick around. Otherwise, feel free to skip ahead to my thoughts on chapter 1128. That said, let's get into it. Chapter 1127 is titled Adventure in the Land of Mystery, adding another entry to the ever-growing list of chapter titles that mark the beginning of a new journey. We've had these sorts of titles all throughout the series ever since we entered the Grand Line, and while not all of them have necessarily been in the same pattern in the English translations, they do all tend to be in the same format in the original Japanese text. They often signify the start of a new island's adventure, but don't always necessarily describe the island perfectly, usually to keep up the mystery of the island. And here in this chapter, we find our heroes in a place seemingly made of Lego bricks. But before we get into that, it would be remiss if I didn't briefly touch on the 15th entry to the Yamato cover story, as we find Yamato taking a meal break alongside Dogstorm, who we learn is the new daimyo of Kuri, a position that was last held by Oden himself. We saw earlier in the cover story that Denjiro had become the daimyo of Kibi, and as such, it would seem the rest of the Scabbards will also take up leadership roles as daimyo of each of the regions. Now, we saw Cat Viper had found a home with the Yakuza in the Flower Capital, where Kinemon also resided, which leaves Kiku, Raizo, and Kawamatsu as the potential remaining Scabbards to become the daimyo of the other three regions. Oden had met Raizo and Udon, making me think that's where we'll see him next as the daimyo, but it's a bit hard to say where Kiku and Raizo will end up, since they both have an attachment to Ringo, but whoever isn't the daimyo of Ringo will likely end up as the daimyo of Hakumai. Now, in this entry, we learn that Dogstorm has grown concerned over the increase in abductions that we've seen throughout this cover story. It appears the blade that he once had on his leg has either been sheathed or replaced with a peg. We actually saw similarly with Cat Viper's gun hand being removed earlier in the cover story. All of this would help to signify a new era of peace for Wano, and in a similar vein, I'm enjoying how much we're seeing Yamato eat in this cover story as they travel from region to region, as if to show us how food is plentiful around the country once again. As for the chapter itself, I know there was a ton of wild speculation going on over the last few weeks, ranging from mysteries to inconsistencies in the art. Some of these were addressed in 1128, but I'm going to approach this chapter with what my thoughts were the week the chapter came out, so even if some of my speculations were wrong or didn't quite pan out, I think it's still fun to document them. So immediately off the bat, we're met with the denizens of this Lego village. Given their size in relation to the Stingmores, I immediately suspected that these were not actually giants, as we soon see that the giant bee is not that much larger than Nami herself. If this truly was supposed to be Elbaf, giant bees would still be proportionally small to actual giants, and this would be true for the other animals we see throughout the chapter as well. Also, we know that the Lego architecture is at scale for normal humans like Nami, as she's able to look out a window that would be too small for a giant, and later we even see a bunch of human skulls scattered on the ground. The people of this place mention Yggdrasil, which is of course a sacred tree in Norse mythology. When I first read this, some more red flags rose for me, as this was clearly not the same tree that has been teased at the center of the island before. That tree was much larger and seemingly towered the entire island, and with the villagers making references to various gods, it seemed to me that these people may have been taught some abridged version of Norse mythology. While Oda does draw from real-world histories and cultures, calling this tree Yggdrasil seemed a bit too on the nose. Coupled with the Lego structures, I feel there's a bit of artifice at play, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about chapter 1128. Now we learn as the chapter progresses that the ear god was a rabbit defeated by Luffy, but the mention of the sun god is quite interesting. You see, in the Japanese text, the sun god is usually written as Taiyo no Kami, no being a possessive particle that indicates the concept of the sun being linked to this god. And this is how every other instance of the sun god has been written across the series, from more recent mentions by the Giants, to Carmel's creation of Pandora on Elbaf, even all the way back to the Shandians' evocation of the god during the Nolan flashback. However, here is written slightly differently. As you can see, it's lacking the possessive particle no. Without it, this would be read as Taiyo Shin, similar to how the Japanese religion Shinto is read. Obviously, I am not a native Japanese speaker myself, so I don't have all of the nuances of this distinction, but what I can glean from it is that Oda is seemingly drawing a contrast between this sun god that is being referred to by the people of the Lego village and the sun god that we've been told about this whole time, once again adding to the artificial nature of this place. Also of note, the worship of these large animals as gods is very reminiscent of what we saw in Wano with the mountain god or with the Shandians in Kashigami. That said, while we do meet the sun god in the following chapter, I did think about the possibility of Pandora being involved. This was of course the fire homie that Mother Carmel made to save the village in an effort to play into the Elbaf giant's beliefs. Now Pandora was taken to the relocated House of Lambs, which would eventually become part of present-day Totoland, and while we suspect Mother Carmel to have died, allowing Big Mom to acquire the Soul fruit, it's largely unknown what happens to homies once the fruit user passes on. We've still yet to get any closure on Big Mom's fate after the events of Wano, though we do know Zeus is still around. At the time, I wondered if Pandora could have been returned to Elbaf to be revered as a god. Also on the topic of Mother Carmel, the new giant warrior pirate Goldberg has a shield that may also be animated by the Soul fruit, perhaps having been gifted to him by Carmel since she was there when he was born alongside Road and Loki. Now, if you've been online, I'm sure you've seen all of this crazy talk about the various inconsistencies in this chapter, to the point where some fans thought that there was more going on than we were seeing on the page, and I'll admit, at the time, I too wondered if there was some sort of trickery or foul play going on to mess with Nami's mind. So let's talk about all of these errors, starting with character designs. In 1126, we got the first look at her Elbaf outfit, which featured a circular belt buckle that looks to have become more rectangular in this chapter. Not only that, but the end of her sword has been updated to a more specific design with concentric circles, perhaps a hole. This sword actually disappears a few times, as we see when she encounters the Stingmore and when she lands beside Usopp. Nami also has a necklace that is sometimes not drawn, and the band on her left arm also disappears from time to time. And we also never see any sign of her tattoo, though one could argue that it's always covered up by her cloak. Similar design inconsistencies occur with Usopp as well, who has a bag in some scenes, but is drawn without it later on. But the most particular has to be with Luffy, who is first shown without a weapon on his back, but immediately after depicted with a sword, and in the very subsequent panel shown with an axe instead. Not only that, but his beloved straw hat is nowhere in sight in this chapter, as it does not poke out underneath his helmet, nor is it affixed on his backside. Other irregularities include Luffy using what is clearly a Gear 3rd technique, but calling it Gear 4th, with the debut of his Gum Gum Elephant Whip. This is of course the logical progression of his Gum Gum Giant Whip, but with armament hockey applied, similar to his Gum Gum Elephant Gun. A similar technique was actually first debuted in the anime back during Dressrosa, though it was then called Gum Gum Giant Whip, armament hardening. There's also an inconsistency with Sanji charging up his right leg for his Ifrit Jump Epaulet strike, but instead hitting the enemy with his left leg. This is also the debut of this move, as Sanji has not used an Epaulet technique with Ifrit Jump before this. And while we're on the topic, I should mention that this spread is a callback to the pre-time skip version of this combination technique, where the trio took down a Sandora lizard. Each technique has been upgraded of course, and Zoro's move is the only one not new here, as we actually saw him use the Black Rope Dragon Twister back during Fishman Island, and more recently on Onigashima with Enma in hand. But back to the hallucination and illusion discussions, some people may feel the dialogue from Luffy, Sanji, and Zoro are a bit off as well, but I think that's more likely a result of them reading scanslations that altered some of the intent of these lines. For example, while Luffy does pass on eating the cat, he still expresses interest in other animals, and while the scans may have made it seem like Sanji was not afraid of insects with his comments about the bees, it's obvious in the official translation that he's actually just talking about the honey they produce. Now for me, one of the major reasons to think something weird was going on was because we got most of this chapter from Nami's point of view. At the end, she finds the trio so casually accustomed to the strangeness of this land, which could lead one to believe that they aren't actually themselves. After all, Luffy used the wrong name for this technique, and he's not concerned at all where his straw hat is. There's also some reason to believe that these errors may be intentional based on Oda having Nami recall the line from the previous chapter about the absinthe, though personally, I have a hard time believing that the Giants would be knocked out for 2 whole days off of a beverage that they seem to be able to drink so casually. Personally, I suspect that there's some foul play going on from an external party. The point about hallucinations is still interesting though, when you consider that Usopp immediately decides to test out this hypothesis for Nami, as if he wasn't already aware what he was experiencing as real. It doesn't make much sense for him to suddenly think the cat chasing them is fake when he started the chapter off in its teeth. Not only that, when Usopp and Nami fall out of the Lego castle, we don't actually see them land. It cuts to black and we find Nami beside Usopp, who was heavily damaged from the fall, while Nami herself seems to be fine. It's almost as if this is a weird dreamlike sequence where Nami dreams herself falling, but immediately skips the aftermath. I think any of these things alone wouldn't be quite enough to raise a flag, but all of these errors in conjunction with these curious logical leaps really makes you wonder if there's something greater at play. I should say, it's also quite possible that all of these are simple mistakes or inconsistencies from Oda. We know he often makes character design mistakes that need to get corrected in volume format, and even then some of them still slip through. Given that this chapter is the third consecutive chapter in a row before a break, and is the start of a new arc, and introduced a ton of new designs, it's fairly plausible to me that Oda and his team may have been in a bit of a rush to get the chapter completed in time. And given how we don't really see anything super out of the ordinary in 1128, I think this may even just be the case. Now, before moving on to the next chapter, I'd also like to talk about my initial thoughts on this cat that could turn into a lion. To me, this also felt like a bit of a fever dream or dreamlike sequence, as we don't actually see the cat transform, but rather are shown the lion after we cut to black. Though I guess we do see it revert back to cat form later on when it's defeated. That said, what could this be? It could be as simple as the cat having some sort of lion zone fruit, but there was also some part of me that even speculated if this was some sort of royal, given the crown and cape. In Norse mythology, Loki is known for his trickery and shapeshifting, so that could totally check out given the silhouette we saw of Loki having a similar crown and cape as well. Also of note, a similar Cheshire cat-like lion was featured in the chapter 582 color spread alongside a rabbit, which I believe is pure coincidence, but is very fun given the presence of the cat and the ear god in this chapter. We'll just have to see what actually is going on with this cat, if it's a devil fruit related power or some other form of magic, but with all of that said, let's talk about 1128. This chapter picks up right where 1127 left off, as our East Blue crew regroups and assesses their situation. Sanji points out that this can't be a dream since there are too many men in it, which is funny when you consider a cover illustration from a while back where Sanji is dreaming of beating up Zoro. I also love how Luffy tells Usopp that he could have defeated the cat, making me wonder if there will be some sort of Kobe-esque moment for Usopp where he realizes that he was capable of this the whole time, but was only held back by his lack of self-confidence. Though what's interesting to me is that we learn Usopp woke up in the mouth of the cat, which brings back to the question, who exactly was it that was calling out to Nami at the end of 1126? Last chapter, I had settled on it being Usopp since he calls out to her while she is still in the castle before she gets to the window. It was unlikely to be Zeus since Nami summons him after she is already awake and he's just as confused as she is. It could be the case that Usopp somehow sensed that Nami was in the castle and was calling for her at the end of 1126, and she would not have realized who the voice belonged to since she doesn't wake up until after he calls out. All of that to say, I'm not exactly certain who it's supposed to be, but if it is Usopp, it may be some hint of his latent observation Haki, sensing her presence in the castle, perhaps even setting up more for him in the future. Sanji mentions how he can't sense Robin using his radar, referring to his ability to pick up on the presence of women, as we've seen throughout the series. It was somewhat formalized during the Egghead arc as his lady radar, but here, he incorporates his sense of smell into it, similar to a dog. Now, I'm not sure if it's actually related, but he did present himself as a dog before Stussy during the last arc. The crew takes note of the strange terrain around them, even the plants are made out of these blocks, and there's no noticeable breeze at all. Later, we would learn that these blocks are made out of something synthetic, though it's still not completely clear what they're actually made of, since we saw in the last chapter that they crumbled and broke apart like regular rock or stone, as opposed to disassembling like Legos. Also of note, we get a much better look at the flag atop the castle, looking to be a star with some accents around. It's unclear if this is just a symbol for this country, or if it's actually a greater symbol in Elbaf. As the crew decides to get some more information in town, they come across a larger man riding a grasshopper. Now, we've seen the animals mounted with handlebars throughout the series before, but this design in particular seems to have been created by Oda for the One Piece movie Strong World. Nami and Sanji both cower in fear, as they're the two on the crew that we know have a particular disdain for bugs. The man explains that this land belongs to the Sun God, and mentions the various other gods that the crew has encountered, much to their discomfort since they defeated them in the last chapter. We learn the ruler of Big Steen Castle is named Master Iskat, which, funny enough, is the cat we met. Most interestingly, this place is known as the Land of Gods, which is also a verbiage that was used to describe the top of the Red Line. Now, by this point, it's become clear that the inhabitants of this place are not giants, as we suspected last week, and this man does not seem to be very surprised at the presence of new people, which would suggest to me that this is a common occurrence. As we'll soon learn enough, someone has been abducting humans and keeping them in this artificial country, though the existing inhabitants look to buy into this whole system of gods and mythology that's been set up. I wonder if this is a genuine belief held by these people, or if this is something instilled into them by fear, where the sun god forces them to behave this way. This would play into the title of the chapter, RPG, or role-playing game, where everyone is made to play out these roles. Everything about this country seems a bit fake or cheap, especially the references to Norse mythology being so on the nose, but implemented in a way that almost borders on caricature. For example, Yggdrasil just being another small tree, or the random raven that's named after a portmanteau of Odin's ravens. There's this whole thing with this false sun god keeping these people trapped just for the real sun god to arrive and liberate the place. That said, the old man tells them not to go the opposite direction toward the sun god's temple, which of course makes Luffy want to go there even more, as seen across the series. He even mentions how he smells adventure, just like he's done before in instances like with Skypiea. I really do enjoy how much this arc has been reminding me of pre-time skip journeys, and it's a really nice change of pace given everything that happened with Wano and Egghead being so dramatic. In his excitement, Luffy runs right ahead into the two-sided mirror that encases the land and ends up cracking it, very reminiscent of the Quake first ability to actually split the sky, and it's with this that the crew finally realizes the truth behind this land. As many speculated, this is an artificial country created by some giant. We see various cloths and textures alongside a sewing machine, and given all the outfits on the mannequins, it really does feel like the giant all of this belongs to is some sort of hobbyist. This is also where they find Chopper chained up, which is quite intriguing given the sun god's appearance with a reindeer skull, but more on that in a bit. The crew encounters the temple soldiers, which we learn is a snake named Hilmengarder, a couple of mice, and a raven named Mugen. Now in Norse mythology, Hugin and Munin were Odin's ravens, so this is a clear play on that. Hilmengarder is a bit harder to place, as it may be a play on Jormungandr, but not sure what else it could be taken from, so if you know, let me know in the comments. The Straw Hats make short work of these guys, as Luffy debuts his Gum Gum Dawn pistol. This technique is very reminiscent of the unnamed punch that he used on Kaido back when he first acquired Gear 5th. Interestingly, Luffy's Gear 5th form here looks to have maintained both his fur cape and his Viking helmet affixed to his backside, whereas in the Egghead arc, his transformation would displace his Egghead clothing immediately. Also of note, we do see Luffy with a straw hat in this chapter, despite it not being present anywhere in 1127. It may feel like overkill that he's using Gear 5th on these animals, but recall that Gear 4th was created in order to beat the giant animals of Ruskaina Island. Luffy could use all the training he could get with this form, and it looks like it's working as he doesn't really wither away after using Gear 5th in this instance. Meanwhile, Zoro has taken down the Raven, perhaps using his Raven Hunt technique. It's to all of this commotion that the Sun God arrives, as we get their design in full. They are adorned with a reindeer skull, a large staff, and a shield, both themed after the sun. We've seen sun-like symbols all throughout the series, but this one here is also quite reminiscent of a tattoo that we saw on one of the giant warrior pirates during the Egghead arc. Now I know there's a lot of speculation between this character and the Holy Knight that we saw during the God Valley flashback, but it should be noted that these are different masks. The Holy Knight had a bovine skull, where this looks to be some sort of reindeer or elk, and not only that, this is not the first time we've seen this sort of skull in the series, as it's often been used for occult or shamanistic imagery. One of the first instances of this kind of skull was in Drum Castle, with Kureha being known as a witch doctor. We would later see these skulls present during the Shandians rituals, and would even see one of the Satanists who were trying to summon Satan on Lazy Bone Island. In fact, we've seen these throughout Elbaf as well, as seen on the top of buildings in Big Mom's flashback. The giant ship have these as well, and we even see more of these in this very room in this chapter. While most of these have looked to be bovine skulls, a similar deer or elk skull is also among the houses in Big Mom's flashback. Now, I've spoken about how this is likely all some sort of game or twisted simulation created by this person. It's not clear if they took the sun god name unto themselves, or if that's what the inhabitants of the land called them. It could be something as simple as them being known as the sun god because they're the one who turns the lights on and off in the room. Either way, based on the clothing, I wonder if the sun god is a woman. The leg warmers and high heels are garments that we've seen worn by Nami and Gerd of the New Giant Warrior Pirates, though I suppose Zoro has an outfit that's sort of similar as well. But with this person being such a talented sewer, I can also see Oda playing into that gender stereotype. We'll just have to see. Whoever the sun god is supposed to be, it's pointed out that they're particularly large, perhaps even for a giant. It's not completely clear given that scaling them is very difficult with humans so small, but I do wonder if there's more to this person than them just being a regular giant. That's about it for all the big things that I wanted to talk about in this chapter. These last two have been a ton of fun with so much adventure, and I love that Oda threw us for a loop at the start of the arc, and I'm looking forward to seeing where we go from here. I apologize for not having consistent manga breakdowns the past 2 weeks. Life's been pretty busy and I've been kind of sick, but I'd love to know your thoughts on the chapter in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.